It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, everybody. I am Jeff Arbuckle, and this is Monster Mondays, presented to you by Film Seizure. This week, we're going to take a little scenic trip up to New England, in Rhode Island, to be exact, to a little town called Eastwick for a slightly different type of monster movie, and that is 1987's The Witches of Eastwick. Now, we'll talk a little bit about why I chose this movie for this show, and what I really kind of see as potentially being what our monster is, of course. But this is based on a 1984 novel by John Updike. And Updike is a particularly important figure in terms of literary achievement and works, because he is one of only 4 writers to have ever won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction twice. That's a big deal. And this was also one of 2 Eastwick novels. He wrote a sequel to this that came out right around the time of his death in the early 2000s, or I guess it was 2008 or so. He often wrote about 3 particular themes: sex and death, which I think are definitely represented to a certain degree in this movie and in this novel that he had, but also the third and the most strange, which is the United States, but not in the sense that all of his stories took place in the United States or in a particular town or anything like that, but the U.S. from a nostalgic perspective, the Americana, the very things that you sometimes hear people say that they're trying to preserve in our country today. This kind of idyllic idea of what Americana is. And he used that as he mixed that in with the other themes to kind of create how some things could be in opposition to those old things that we're trying so desperately to hold on to, how sometimes the old things are preserved in different ways, and so forth. What I find very interesting about this, and the reason why I chose this movie, is that I think that this, if maybe not this movie, but maybe the novel itself, ends up becoming extremely influential in other things that end up kind of following in the 90s and into the 2000s. In particular, the idea of witch and witchcraft and the witchy kind of coven of a trio of witches, or sometimes 4 witches. I think that this probably helped things like The Craft get made, or the TV series Charmed, which was incredibly popular in the late 90s and then the early 2000s. I also think that this movie inspired a great deal of another very popular movie, only about 2 witches, but still nonetheless very lighthearted in its tone, Practical Magic. In the 90s, there were a ton of movies that dealt in some way, shape, or form of casting spells, being in a witch, being in a coven, and being kind of doing things and kind of making things happen for yourself. Not necessarily horror in every regard, but in a lot of ways, I think this movie and Updike's novel was particularly influential in that. Now, this movie was directed by George Miller. This was his first feature-length movie that was made that was not a Mad Max movie. He did in the Twilight Zone, he did one piece of that anthology, but in terms of an entire movie, this was his first movie outside of the Mad Max universe. Now, of course, the 4 Mad Max movies are extremely popular, but this is a huge production for him. So, he went from making essentially what's called Ozploitation with the first Mad Max movie to a kind of bonkers action post-apocalyptic movie with The Road Warrior, to then a larger kind of more mainstream Hollywood feel with Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome, to this. And it's clear to see that he does have a sense of wonder to him, a sense of movie making acumen. And of course, after this, he would go on to make a really important drama in Lorenzo's Oil. He would then also make one of my favorite movies of the 90s, Babe. And he also made the sequel, Babe, Pig in the City. These are really, really wide-ranging types of movies. You wouldn't expect the guy who made some of the Mad Max movies make a movie about talking barn animals and make it so good too. He is really a very good director, and he doesn't make movies year after year after year after year. He's very he's almost purposeful in, if I'm going to make a movie, I'm going to spend time to make sure I'm making a good movie and not just cranking stuff out each and every year. The one thing about this movie is that almost everybody knows will be the stars of the movie. The main star of this movie, of course, is Jack Nicholson, and he's the other reason why I picked this movie for this show. He is a monster in every sense of the word. He is a monster in terms of being a misogynistic pig in some scenes, and he's quite literally a monster as well for being the literal devil. By the end of this movie, he turns into a gigantic monster. He is overpowering in this movie. However, we also can definitely recognize the trio of witches. Cher and Susan Sarandon are pretty much at the top of their game at this point. Susan Sarandon had been making movies since the 70s, had breakout performances in things like the Rocky Horror Picture Show. I think she was also in Atlantic City in the early part of the 80s. Cher had just recently won an Oscar for Moonstruck. So she was kind of leaving her Sonny and Cher persona in the dust with that. And then we also have the kind of the young and innocent character in this who kind of breathes the life into this movie, which is Michelle Pfeiffer. And she is kind of in her own trajectory at this stage. And then there are two supporting cast people who are no strangers to things that could be covered on the show or have been covered on the show. Veronica Cartwright is a scene-stealing supporting part as kind of the main villain from the town, not who's in direct opposition to Jack Nicholson, who is of course the existential villain of the movie. But Veronica Cartwright was in Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds as a young girl, and then in the late 70s she had two back-to-back huge monster movies, one being Invasion of the Body Snatchers from 1978, a very well-regarded remake of the classic 50s movie. Then she was in Alien, of course, was just a game changer when it comes to how you can make science fiction truly, truly scary, and you can still feel the influence of Alien to this day. Then she was in Candyman, Farewell to the Flesh, which was the sequel to the original Candyman. We've covered that on Film Seizure before. And then in 2007, she was in the most recent version of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which was just called The Invasion. Then we have playing her husband in this, Richard Jenkins, who we've seen recently on the show. He was, of course, fantastic in The Shape of Water, and he had a very bit part at the very beginning of Kong Skull Island. He was the senator that John Goodman had to go and see to get the escort out to Kong Island, or to Skull Island, rather. So, really quickly, I mean, this movie kind of starts off with an introduction to our three leading ladies. We have Alexandra, who is Cher, who is a frustrated widow. She has I think, teenage daughter, and she is very, very frank in the way that she speaks. She is very outspoken. She is very much Cher. We also meet Jane, who is Susan Sarandon, who is recently divorced. She's a music teacher, and she's very mousy. We also find out that she very likely got a divorce because she couldn't bear children, which becomes very important later. And then Suki, who is Michelle Pfeiffer, who is a mother of 6 daughters, somehow still energetic to have a full-time career as a writer at the local newspaper, and take care of her kids and get them off to school, and take part in all of her extracurricular activities for herself. Like I said, she kind of breathes the life into this movie. But her husband abandoned her for having so many kids. They had unwittingly created a coven. They have certain natural powers that aren't really explained, but they kind of feed a little bit. At one point, they share a moment where they are kind of wishing for something to interrupt and stop this really, really boring town event that got this really long and boring speech from this philanderer who has at some point in time made a pass at each one of these 3 women. And what they end up accidentally creating is a huge thunderstorm that rains out the rest of this boring event and speech. Later that night, they are kind of having cocktails and just kind of talking about what they would see as being the perfect man that would come into their life, and kind of allow for them to express themselves in different ways. And as they're talking about this, a mysterious man, who we later find out to be Daryl Van Horn, who is Jack Nicholson, he is speeding into town. He ends up buying this landmark that ruffles the feathers of Veronica Cartwright's Felicia Alden. As the town meets this man, they aren't able to remember what his name is until at some point the 3 witches, 3 unknowing witches, I might add. It's always important to understand that they kind of don't really ever think of themselves as witches. But they piece out and figure out the name of this new mysterious man. At that point in time, it unlocks the memories of everybody else in town who remembers them. At the same time, it creates an accident that ends up causing Felicia her leg to get broken. And as she recovers from that, she begins kind of becoming this religious zealot, saying that there's this devil in town, that evil is starting to rot this town out from the inside out like a cancer, and he's got whores that are going to help him, and they will, he will try to impregnate them so that he can further his reach by way of his children and so forth. Well, that's exactly what Daryl is trying to do. He begins by seducing Alex by being just as frank as she is, and being, speaking his mind in ways that are reprehensible, but it is kind of meeting Alex on her level. And it ends up working on her, and he seduces her and then moves on to Jane, who he uses music to bring out the sexual animal inside of her. And she is the one who changes the most. She goes from being mousy and reserved to being very outward and very sexy, and she flaunts her sexuality much, much more. And then he seduces, after laying bare that, yes, indeed, he has seduced her friends. He then turns his sights on Suki and seduces her, really, I think, by just being kind and being honest with her. He is a completely different person when he's speaking to her than he was to the other 2. And it's a really kind of sweet scene, because she's like, so you're going to probably try to seduce me too, right? And he just flat out says, yeah, I am. And she's like, okay, well, that's great. You don't have to get me drunk. You don't have to give me drugs or anything. Those things don't work on me. They never explain that. But she says, there is one thing you should probably know. I get pregnant, like, a lot. And, it's like pretty much every time she's ever had sex, she has gotten pregnant. To which he's like, oh, I'll keep that in mind. It's a very honest scene, and it's very charming between the two of them. Of course, and it works on her too, which then creates this new personality for these three. They're much more confident. They're much more assured. They feel much more in control, even though they're being manipulated. But they have discovered their powers, and he kind of stokes this inside them too, where they begin to discover that they really do have some powers, and it might be coming from him, but it is something that they have dabbled with but never really actually confronted, that maybe they are witches indeed. Things take a dark turn though, because as Felicia begins to turn the town against the women, they start wishing upon something bad to happen to her, and Daryl is there to kind of make that happen. And through kind of an unwitting spell that they don't even really know that they're doing, but they're being kind of egged on by Daryl, they end up creating a situation in which Richard Jenkins' character has to kill Felicia because of the way that she's acting and the way that she's kind of lost control, and some of his own sadness over her not being the person that she once was, which was stated in an earlier scene. When this happens, they realize, whoa, we gotta cool it with this stuff. And they try to stay away from Daryl, which makes Daryl kind of devolve into this very desperate person, because he needs them to basically bear sons for him to do the things that he's trying to do. And he becomes this kind of pathetic begging man, and it's kind of it turns the power structure on its head, because once he starts to use their own fears that he's learned about them against them when they're staying away, which also leads to Suki getting really, really sick and almost dying, Alex understands what he is after and uses it against him. So the women end up seducing Daryl, and then they are able to take everything that they've learned and basically fight him off in his most crazed and most dangerous versions of himself. That includes a giant demon monster thing at the end of the movie. They do end up giving birth to 3 sons, but they make it very clear that they are going to do everything that they can to protect their sons from the influence of their father. So, let's talk about the 3 things I like about The Witches of Eastwick. First and foremost, this movie has really sharp and smart dialogue. I can understand why everybody wants to be in this movie that they got. These are all very juicy roles for the 3 leading ladies. It's there's something in the text and in the subtext that provides a very powerful statement about female sexuality, the ability to shake off the shackles of being tied to a man, even though there are plenty of scenes in which they are dependent on Daryl. They often ask themselves in the middle of scenes, why do we need to ask him about anything? Why can't we just make a decision and do it? These are things that are not very common in movies, particularly of that time. It kind of marries the idea of being able to be very sexual and being very independent at the same time. And it plays out a lot in a lot of really fun scenes and a lot of fun dialogue in it. There is one scene in particular that is just so goofy, but it's so charming and so interesting, in which Daryl and the three witches are playing tennis, and they are at first upset with each other because he seduced them independently, but then they start using some of their powers, and they use some of their, so it's full of these kind of fun scenes like that. But then there's also a lot of scenes of just really smart dialogue, particularly from Cher. There are some things that Jack Nicholson is saying that you almost sit there and think, hey, he might have a point there, but then you realize, oh no, he's being a terrible, awful person. What he's saying is wrong, and it's very smart in that way that he is also seducing the audience. But then you also have the role for Veronica Cartwright that is full of these verbose scenes of her shouting and yelling about whores and the devil and all of this stuff that, she is kind of uppity at the beginning, but then she goes way off the rails, and it had to be fun to want to play these parts with this dialogue. And that also brings me to my second the actors in this are just phenomenal. I mean, this is a powerhouse cast, and like I said, this is George Miller. This was only the fourth featured-length movie that he had ever made, and the fifth movie that he had worked on. And he is working with Jack Nicholson, a multiple Oscar winner at this time, multiple Oscar nominee Susan Sarandon, Michelle Pfeiffer, who is on her way to the top very shortly after this, Oscar winner Cher, and he is he is masterfully directing this movie, and these are fantastic actors doing fantastic things, and doing things that go back and forth from being somewhat dark to somewhat goofy and comedic, and it all mixes together so well because the cast is so good at understanding of what they're playing. Then thirdly, there's one element to this movie that I picked up on immediately at the beginning, and I think it ties back to John Updike and his love of Americana, and that is the cinematography in this movie. There is something about these movies that came out in the second half of the 80s and the first half of the 90s. I don't know if it was just the styles of the time, or if it was the cameras of the time, or if it was the film stock itself. But there are things that where if you gave me a frame of movies like this one that just is a shot of the scenery, I could tell you this is most definitely made anywhere from 1986 to 1995. I don't know what it is, and maybe it's my own personal connection and the subconsciousness of knowing I'm watching a movie from 1987. It takes place in a small town, and it all melds into this this beautiful landscape that they shoot. The small town that's surrounded by practically nothing, and of course the mansion that Daryl buys is out in the middle of nowhere. But it's more than that. It's the color of the grass or the sky, or the composition of the shot, or how the camera is doing overhead shots as opposed to a crane shot, or opposed to a shot where you have the actors up front and you see the mansion way off in the background. There is something so very 80s about this in all of the right ways that I appreciate, and I have a hard time not loving movies that appreciate the way that it's shooting, its locations, its landscape, its everything. And it is a gorgeous movie, and the whole time I'm sitting there thinking, man, I wanna live in this small Rhode Island town, even though there are some weirdos there who are gonna be worried that because I'm the new guy in town that I'm some sort of demon or something that's come to mess up the town and seduce their ladies. Trust me, I would be doing these things. But what I'm getting at is that I would want to live in this town, even with the weirdos and all of the gossip that would go around in the small town of 7,500 people. It just makes for a wonderful viewing experience. It triggers all the right things in my brain, and I love when movies are shot like that. Even if I don't end up really liking the movie, this movie I did like very much. But if it was a movie that if I didn't end up liking this movie, I would still think that the scenery and that the cinematography was gorgeous. So that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. Now, don't forget to check out new episodes of Film Seizure every Wednesday morning, and you get new installments of Monster Mondays each Monday afternoon on filmseizure.com. You can also find these shows places where you can find other fine podcasts like SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spotify, Audible. Hell, we even upload the episodes to YouTube, so you can check that out as well. You can also hop on over to Facebook and Twitter to follow us by just searching for Film Seizure. And while you're at it, head over to my website, bmovieenema.com. You can read new text articles each and every Friday morning. You can also follow B Movie Enema on Facebook and Twitter by searching for just that, B Movie Enema. And hey, while you're at it, use that same search term, put it into the search bar in YouTube, and follow the B Movie Enema channel, where you can find episodes of B Movie Enema, the series, where I host a full-length movie. Season 1 is up there already. Season number 2 starts September 11th, so be ready for that. So until next week, stay spooky.